We are the Academic Distinction Fund, known in the community as ADF, and we collaborate with the area businesses, nonprofit organizations, and education and pre-K stakeholders in order to bring high-quality resources to the classrooms within East Baton Rouge Parish School System. We are focusing, though, on early childhood education, which means that we're working to prepare students for kindergarten and first grade so that they can be successful in their school experiences.
And what are we doing here tonight?
This is very important because we know that the state of Louisiana does not invest the amount of money that it needs to in order to provide high-quality pre-kindergarten education. And so Dr. Stephen Barnett tonight is going to talk about the economic investment in pre-K and the return on investment. It's so important for business leaders who are here tonight to see the evidence and to get the reports on proven research that shows that investing in early education does pay off with tremendous benefits, from money to public welfare benefits and to higher graduation rates, decrease incarceration, as well as higher success rates from high school to college to careers. And this can only help our tax base by getting more people employed by having a good education.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Matt Siraj. I'm the chairman of the board of Community Coffee Company. I'm also the chairman of the board for Academic Distinction Fund. I want to thank you for being here and welcome you this afternoon. I'm pleased that you came to the speaker series to hear from Dr. Steve Barnett, and I think you're in for a real treat. As I look around, I see familiar faces. So I know many of you have attended the speaker series over the 3 years that it's been put on here in Baton Rouge, and I hope that you really are gaining value from it and actually putting your learning here to work in our community. We feel it's very important. Dr. Barnett today is going to present information, research data, and compelling information on the investment and the economic benefits of early childhood education. That's a different take on early childhood education, and I believe you're really going to see something interesting that really applies to a broader spectrum than just learning, but the community we live in. I do want to welcome a few people as I look out. I don't want to just call names, but I'll just by groups identify people who are here. Baton Rouge and Louisiana elected officials, thank you for attending. I see board members from Academic Distinction Fund, thank you for attending. Representatives from East Baton Rouge Parish and from LSU, and representatives from our sponsors. And as the screen was scrolling earlier, I hope you got to see who our sponsors are, because without them, we couldn't put on the speaker series as we do today. So please, a round of applause for all of our guests and for our sponsors. I also like to recognize Dr. Martise Jones and her staff, who put on the Distinguished Speaker Series and do a fabulous job. Thank you for your organization and for bringing this to Baton Rouge. At this time, I want to pay special attention to our Speaker Series lead presenting sponsor, ExxonMobil. Through ExxonMobil's generous sponsorship, we're able to offer this as free community education. Many of you benefit from learning world-class information from top speakers and research on the current early childhood topics, relevant information, and it really is up-to-date relevant information for you. Other benefits, of course, are our continuing education unit, CLUs, clock hours, and other educational benefits, but learning is a primary benefit we'd like to give you today. And we'd like you to please join me in welcoming Ken Miller, who is the manager of engineering for ExxonMobil, and he has the responsibility for introducing our guest speakers. So Ken, want to join me up here, please?
Thank you, Matt. And as Matt said, I'm Ken Miller, the engineering manager for the ExxonMobil facilities here in Baton Rouge. Many of you probably know our company's heavily involved in education outreach, and sponsoring today's early childhood education lecture is something that we're proud to be a part of and we believe is critical to the community. This ADF partnership provides free education to the community, and we're very proud to be able to sponsor it. We believe high education standards will give our children what they deserve, the opportunity to compete locally, globally, and nationally to the best of their ability. Louisiana has a very dynamic and changing economy right now, and it is continuing to require more and more education and higher skills to compete effectively in the workforce that we have. Our education outreach goal is to help our state develop the qualified, professional, and highly skilled workforce that we need to drive our economy and to make Louisiana citizens competitive across the nation and around the world. Last year, we announced funding for the ExxonMobil North Baton Rouge STEM initiative. This $450,000 grant to improve science, technology, engineering, and math education in North Baton Rouge. It's a 3-year commitment to support local teachers and students utilizing existing groups that were already supporting education in the local area. Besides financially supporting education, you may have noticed some of our volunteers out there as you walked in tonight. These employees and many more spend countless hours in working classrooms in North Baton Rouge and have been for more than 20 years. They really know how to reach children and show them that math and science can be a lot of fun. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stephen Barnett, who's an expert on child development. Dr. Barnett's the director of the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University. His research demonstrates the substantial economic returns that preschool education can produce. Today, Dr. Barnett will talk to us about the quality of early childhood education and how important quality programs are in obtaining results. We'll hear about why even the most advantaged children don't attend quality programs and how we can offer effective preschool education to all young students. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Barnett.
I'm an economist, and so I started studying early childhood programs because I was interested in the economics of human development. I've been doing that now for nearly 30 years. But I want to start with a broader view than just economics, because the case for investing in public resources in early childhood care and education isn't just about the economics. Right? As I think most parents know, but as has become increasingly clear from a variety of sciences, the first 5 years really lay the foundations for a lifetime in terms of language development, academic abilities, habits, dispositions, social emotional development, things like whether you take personal responsibility or you blame your problems on somebody else, are important characteristics of us throughout a lifetime, but the foundations of these are really built in the first 5 years. Now, the window for influencing this development doesn't close when you turn 6, but it turns out it's a lot more expensive to change someone after the first 5 years, particularly if things have gone badly wrong. Now, high-quality early childhood care and education that enhances learning and development not only has important consequences for human development over a lifetime, it turns out that those have very strong economic implications. And so high-quality early childhood programs can have high economic returns. I'm going to talk about why that is more specifically. But it's also important to understand that these long-term economic benefits are in the form of what economists call externalities. It's a kind of fancy word that basically means spillover. That anyone who's taught in a classroom understands that the primary detriments to misbehavior in a classroom are not to the learning of the child who's misbehaving, it's to the learning of all of the other kids in the classroom. That's just a small example of what we mean by a spillover, and again, I'll talk extensively about that. And then finally, I think it's important to understand that despite the fact that science has really been very clear about the benefits of early childhood programs, if these programs are of high quality, today in the United States, access to high quality is very limited and highly unequal. So, to be more specific about the gains from investing in early childhood, as I'll explain, my first experience was studying the adult consequences of early childhood programs. And so I focused on things like increased achievement test scores, decreased special education, grade repetition, increased educational attainment. The kids who went to preschool were more likely to graduate from high school and go on to college. If you think about this systemically as programs that also provide child care, from an economic perspective, they're important not just because of the benefits for the child, but also because they support maternal employment and earnings. And if you put all of this together and look at the impacts on society, early childhood programs have a lot of promise to reduce the cost of school failure, to decrease the cost of social services, crime, and even health care, because your early childhood experiences actually become embedded in your biology, and cardiologists are now studying the roots of adult cardiac disease in the early childhood years. Because early childhood programs can increase adult productivity and economic growth for both parent and child. And all of these things together have tremendous potential to decrease social and economic inequality. Now, as you get into public policy debates about this, you will see that a lot of people seem to disagree. And they will cite studies that support their point of view. And the nature of science is that you can find a study to support any point of view you want. That doesn't mean that science as a whole supports any point of view you want. So the way we actually do good science is to look at what does all of the research in a field say. And so what this chart does is show a statistical summary of all of the studies of the impacts of early childhood programs on cognitive abilities since 1960. And it's just a statistical summary. It's not my perspective on what the evidence shows. It's not somebody else's view. It's just the average effects across all these studies on cognitive development at the end of preschool, right, which is typically age 5, between ages 5 and 10, and from ages 10 on. It's looking at all kinds of research designs. That's the yellow bar. The blue bar says, well, what if we only look at more rigorous research studies? What happens then? Are effects smaller or larger in the best studies? And then it asks the question, well, what if we look at better quality programs? Because all programs aren't the same, and if programs were more optimally designed, what would effects be? And so you can see there's substantial effects at the end of treatment. There are large and substantial effects later on, but later effects are smaller. So when you hear about fade out, there's some truth to that. Long-term effects are smaller than immediate effects. And that's true with just about anything that you do in life, including preschool. But they do not disappear. Right? And you can see, right, beyond age 10, they're fairly sizable. I'll tell you a little bit more about what these effect sizes mean. And they're larger in more rigorous studies, so better studies actually yield evidence of stronger effects. And if we make programs more optimally designed, they have even larger effects. So the immediate effect in rigorous studies of more optimally designed programs at kindergarten entry is about 0.9 standard deviation. So what does that mean? Well, a standard deviation turns out to be almost exactly the size of the achievement gap between middle-income kids and poor kids, or between minority kids and white kids. So if you're concerned about the achievement gap, an optimally designed preschool program has the potential to close almost the entire gap at kindergarten entry by itself. That's a big deal. Now, I don't mean necessarily 1 year of preschool at 4, right? There's 5 years before you get to kindergarten. And if we look at long term, the effect size is between 0.4 and 0.5, right? So that's saying preschool by itself could close half the achievement gap through the end of high school. Again, that's a pretty big deal. Right, so what did we learn from this? It's called a meta-analysis when we do this kind of summary research. What did we learn from this besides the average effect sizes? I talked about more optimal programs. What does that mean? Well, it means intentional teaching matters. Right? We don't just get kids in a room and let them do whatever they want. And teachers don't just observe children playing. Play is the good thing. There's a lot that kids learn through play, but teachers need to engage with it and intentionally work at each child learning what that child needs. And that gets to the second point, which is individualization in small groups. Right? So we get larger effects with intentional teaching. We get larger effects with programs that individualize, work one-on-one with kids, and work with kids in small groups. And we get smaller effects with comprehensive services, social services, health, etc. And that is certainly not what we expected to find. That's why we do research. Right? If we knew all the answers, we wouldn't have to study things. Why is it? Well, I think it's largely because the comprehensive programs that we have try to do too much with too little. And that's an important lesson for us to learn as a field. And finally, as you saw in that chart very clearly, if we want big short-term gains, we're going to have really big, if we want big long-term gains, we're going to have really big short-term gains because they're going to be smaller. So if we want those big gains long-term, we have to have really big effects right up front. Well, I want to talk about a study that did that. Those of you who are in early childhood or have been exposed to the early childhood literature at all around public policy know about the Perry Preschool study. It started in the early 1960s. This is actually the first study I worked on. I started working when the kids were in the age 19 follow-up. I'm not that much older than the kids in the Perry Preschool study, where we're now doing the age 50 follow-up. It's a true randomized trial. These kids went to preschool, these kids didn't. Let's look at the differences. And they're all from the same neighborhood. Flip a coin to decide who got in which group. Right? So at kindergarten entry, the kids who went to preschool had higher IQs. They had higher achievement test scores all the way through age 14. They were doing more homework when they were 14. They were less likely to need special education. They were more likely to graduate on time, less than half versus 2/3 for this disadvantaged population. They were less likely to have discipline problems, to be reported as problems by their teachers in the classroom. A little later on, they're less likely to be arrested at 15, 19, and 27, and 40. They're less likely to be involved in violent crime, less likely to have been involved in drug crime. And as adults, they earn more money. Not much difference in whether they're employed or not. If you're 40 years old in the United States and you don't have a job, government isn't going to take care of you. Right? So there's not much alternative for most people to having a job. They have jobs. The difference is how productive they are at those jobs. They're more likely to own their own home. They're more likely to own a car. They're more likely to have a savings account. The savings account, as an economist, I find pretty interesting because there's at least a couple of reasons this could be. One is that they've been making more money for the last 20 years, so they have more money to save. That seems obvious. But in interviews with the kids, they have different attitudes and dispositions. They learned plan, do, review in preschool. And that thinking ahead, planning, that's the kind of thing that leads to differences in whether you save money and invest in assets or not. Now, of course, that's a small study with 123 kids, started in the 1960s. What about doing this on a larger scale? Well, we have an example from the Chicago Public Schools called the Child Parent Center, started a couple of decades later. It's like the Perry Preschool, a half-day preschool program at ages 3 and 4. The classes are not as small. In Perry Preschool, they were very small. They had one teacher for every 6 kids. Chicago, they had a teacher and assistant for 18 kids. This is more like what the best state pre-K programs are today. And so what happened to those kids who've now been followed through to their 20s? Well, they're more likely to graduate from high school, less likely to need special education, less likely to repeat a grade, less likely to be arrested as juveniles. All of the same effects, only smaller. So what I think we see is a kind of dose-response relationship. You do the same kind of program, it's a weaker dosage, still strong relative to what most preschool programs in the United States look like. And you get all of the same effects, but smaller. Now, my job as an economist much of the time has been to try to figure out, so what's all this worth in dollar terms? We know what it's worth in human terms. But what if we put a dollar value on it? Right? So my job is to figure out the day the kid walks in the preschool door, how much is this worth as an economic investment? Right? So that means we have to do something called discounting, which is the reverse of compound interest. To make a long story about that short, so when kids in their 20s, we're basically counting each dollar of benefits as about 33 cents. There's a lot of discounting. Nevertheless, the value when you walk in the door of the Perry Preschool, which cost about $18,000 per child, right, not an inexpensive program, was nearly $300,000 per child. Right. The Abecedarian program, which I haven't talked about, is another true experiment, only this one's birth to 5 year-round child care delivering education. And it's much more expensive, about $70,000 per child. And the benefits ran almost $200,000 per child. And then the Chicago Child Parent Center, about $8,000 per child, much more in the realm of good state pre-K programs today. And the benefits about 10 times that, about $83,000. So there's some proportionality between costs and benefits. It's not uniform. These are different places, different times, and all of that affects the benefits. But the basic story that the benefits are a lot bigger than the costs holds true across these 3 studies from very different decades, very different kids, different programs, different parts of the country. Now, I spent a lot of time talking to policymakers, and I find that other people talk to them about preschool too. And they hear that the effects of preschool might look good when the kid's 5, but they fade out, particularly in large-scale public programs, and that those programs can't replicate things like Perry Preschool or Abecedarian or even what the Chicago public schools did, which I find a little hard to believe, having worked in Chicago public schools. But the answer is yes, sometimes effects do fade out and become so small they're basically not detectable. But other times they don't. And if we look across different types of programs, typical child care in the United States has at best very small long-term effects, and they're not always positive. Right? So some of our subsidized child care in the United States is so poor in quality, we may actually be harming kids. Not a lot, but given the potential to produce positive effects, that's pretty sad. Head Start and other comprehensive programs have a weak record in long-term randomized trials of producing positive effects. And state pre-K programs are all over the place in terms of their outcomes, but that should be no surprise because they're all over the place in terms of their design, the elements they deliver and the resources behind them. What I find particularly interesting when you put it all together is that none of the programs that have failed to produce the kinds of returns and results that you got from the Perry Preschool have followed the models that produce large long-term gains. And I think that's an important thing to understand about this field of early childhood, right? The design of the program is critically important for the outcomes. Now that sounds pretty obvious, but if you look at public policies, you wouldn't know that. I want to talk a little bit about the National Head Start Impact Study because it's got a lot of attention. And basic story is 1 year of Head Start had very small positive effects. The lasting effects were smaller than the initial effects. Now, there are still some indications of some effects at grade 3. It's important to understand, because this is a randomized trial, these kids are randomly assigned to go to Head Start, these kids are not. What you compare in this study are the effects of being randomized to a group. Right? So not all the kids randomly assigned to go to Head Start went, and a bunch of the kids who were randomly assigned not to go to Head Start, their parents said, but my kid needs to go to Head Start, and they got them in. Right? And once you adjust for that, it turns out the effects of Head Start are about 50% larger than what everybody talks about, and that's important to understand. And it also doesn't take into account that a lot of the control group went to other public programs. And then finally, if you actually look at what happened to kids over time, it turns out that some of what's fade out is actually that the public schools helped kids catch up. Now, that's really just the reverse of the benefit story I told you about decreasing the cost of schooling by preventing grade repetition, special education, and other extra services in school. And that's how we save money from preschool, but it's because the kids who don't go get more of all those things, and they actually do help. It's just an expensive way of fixing a problem you didn't need to have in the first place. Doesn't mean the preschool program wasn't effective. I also think it's important to understand that these results are from a program that, as it operated a decade ago, Congress mandated reforms of Head Start, and the Bush administration in particular instituted reforms with respect to language and literacy. And we look at the gains in kids' test scores in Head Start over time. It is clear that those reforms worked. And Head Start is today a considerably more effective program, especially with language and literacy, than it was a decade ago when this study was done.